the U.S. Appears to, well, at least recognize that a lot of its military strikes aren't having the effect it had hoped for, and it seems to be shifting a bit now towards economic strangulation, that is pursuing victory by incrementally squeezing and weakening Iran, hoping that any economic problems would cause divisions either in the political system or military or society. But well, from your perspective, what is the U.S. strategy, and how do you think Iran might respond to this?
Well, as long as Donald Trump is president, I'll never try to give an answer to that question because it goes far beyond my mental capabilities. But if I was to just guess, I would say that these are just stabs in the dark. They pursue one policy this week and then grow impatient with it or feel that it's failed, then they move on to a different policy. And that's how the whole 6 months has been, this 6 months of war. I think that obviously the United States never really understood Iran, post-revolution Iran. And U.S. analysts misread Iran. They, uh, their understanding of Iran is often not just problematic, but it is influenced by money, by necessity. And so the analysts who work on Iran in think tanks in the United States or in government or even in academic institutions that are uh, well funded and that are influential, they have an incentive to create a particular narrative on the country. So that has always been the case, and that's why the United States has always, in my opinion, miscalculated uh, Iran. And there's a very good book that I once discussed uh, on your program called "Going to Tehran" by Flint and Hillary Leverett. They worked in the White House, and they wrote this book after they left. Both were academics, and it's a very good book. But they were hammered from left and right, think tankers, um, elites close to the state. They basically had to leave the think tank world, even though they had worked in the White House, and because they were marginalized. So the narrative on Iran is so warped and so absurd that they never get it right. Trump, when he became president, he made it worse because even those analysts that never really understood Iran well, they were all sidelined too. So he had nothing except for the most bizarre uh, uh, understandings of Iran that come out of Fox News and other such outlets to work with. And the same is true with the people around him. And I think that's especially so in the second term, although the first term was like that as well. So they, when the war started last year, the 12-day war, they thought it was over. I'm confident that he thought that Iran would be defeated swiftly. And this war was the same, even though we've seen reports about what happened in the Situation Room. But I believe that even those reports uh, those media reports were written in a way to um, to sort of whitewash the statements or non-statements or the inaction of people around him. Uh, in other words, it wasn't as if they were saying, "No, don't do it. It's not going to work. This will fail." Uh, I think probably they were at best quiet, or they're saying it's not clear if it will work or if the chances of success are questionable and that sort of thing. Because we've seen the public statements of these different people over the years, and we've seen how the Western media has even the likes of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the European media outlets that if your understanding of Iran is founded on these media outlets, you would conclude, in my opinion, that Iran would have failed. Iran would have fallen. Now, maybe you would not get the government that you were looking for, and Iran would become Syria, or Iran would become Libya, and it would fall apart based on that narrative. But this so-called hated regime would not have remained intact, because every time there are riots, which are always supported by Western governments, or funded by them, or armed by them, in the Western media speaks as if Iran is about to fall, or the Islamic regime, as they like to call it, will not remain. So when mainstream Western media are like that, when elites in the United States are like that, then I don't think that we should expect much different from the Situation Room or Trump himself. But Trump would be the worst case, because he would be bound to the narratives of Fox News and Breitbart, and the really crazy segment of the political elite in the United States. So when I'm sure they thought that Iran would fail in the war. I don't believe any of them thought Iran would survive as an Islamic republic, let alone win the war, let alone emerge stronger, which is what happened. So that's one aspect of this. Then they tried everything. They tried sanctions. They tried to use the MOU to deceive Iran. The MOU is basically used as a tool to take control over the Strait of Hormuz without fighting, and to cheat Iran in with regards to implementation. And then, of course, we went back to war, and we are where we are now. So I think this is another act of desperation. They've tried everything. They've tried war. They've tried siege warfare, which failed too, which led to the MOU. They tried cheating Iran through the MOU. They restarted the war. They did everything that they could. And now this is a new policy. But the problem here is that the Iranians no longer have, their hands are no longer tied. We are at war with the United States. There is no ceasefire. And the countries that assisted the United States are part of that war, whether it's the Emirates or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or the Israeli regime or Jordan or anyone else who participated in this war or assisted the United States. We're not at peace with any of them. So now the Iranian response is going to be different than what it was 15, 20 years ago, when the United States began the maximum pressure campaign, which, I mean, the United States began sanctions against Iran literally from almost the start of the revolution. But it was Obama that started the maximum pressure sanctions. And so back then, it was Iran's policy to survive, to find a way to lessen the impact of those sanctions. And they were pretty severe. And gradually, Iran, of course, began to learn how to deal with sanctions. Then we had the nuclear deal. Then Trump came and revived those maximum pressure sanctions, and with greater force. And again, life became difficult for I guess two and a half years. I don't know exactly how long, but I think Iran was exporting literally no oil. If I'm not mistaken, for a time, Iran was exporting 100,000 barrels of oil a day, but it wasn't making money from it. It was a part of a prior commitment to China. Chinese companies had been involved in Iran's oil. development, and that was their profit. They took oil, so Iran wasn't making any money. This time, so Iran was always trying to find a way to weaken the sanctions regime, to be able to breathe, because the sanctions regime was always targeting ordinary people. The objective was to make people suffer, for people to die, for people to lose their jobs, to die of illness, to create insecurity in society, to create misery, so that people would rise up and revolt out of desperation. And even during this war, in the first siege after the 40 days of fighting, we saw U.S. officials, we saw senators, for example, go on Sunday morning shows and say the Iranian people are starving, with a you know gloating about it, with with such happiness that like people had no food, which of course was nonsense. But what the important thing was the sentiment, what they wanted to happen, or what they were saying was happening, and no one on the morning talk shows were saying this is this is a war crime, or even the audience. Uh, Many of them were quite happy to hear such news. Not the majority of Americans, I'm sure, but in any case, they have an audience. So now they are trying to revive this siege warfare. I mean, they have again, but they want to do it with greater intensity. Now we'll have to see what Besant says on Monday. But the last night, this chair of the Supreme National Security Council gave a long interview on television, and he explained what Iran will do in response. So, in short, I just think that uh, this is another stab in the dark. Desperately hope where the government, the U.S. government, Trump, desperately hopes that he'll get a win and pull a rabbit out of the hat. Especially since there's only 2.5 months left till the midterms, and the signs are not good, and the economy is not doing well, and the bond market's not doing well, and the Japanese currency is not doing well. So if he can pull this rabbit out of the hat, maybe that will change the equation.
It's interesting. The underlying point that is that they seemingly believe what they say, and they don't have any understanding for Iran at all. I mean, it didn't always used to be like this, though. I think that after the Cold War, this intensified at least because, well, having a hegemony, it comes with cost. For one, a hegemon does need to understand the world. It's all powerful, and also they often fuel delusions of superiority because if you are dominant, it's the reason behind it. Everyone else is inferior, and in the West, we also saw this rise of very powerful ideology around the idea of a liberal hegemon that is they would forever dominate. It would be a force for good, and the whole world would gravitate towards it. The only ones who wouldn't would be the ones who would abuse their own people and who would reject civilization and history itself. And that's why I think you see every conflict, every tension around the world is always this exact same way of framing. It's always liberal democracy versus some evil regime that doesn't fall in line. And it's I think it's quite dangerous because one of the things which is quite frightening, which one it's become normal now, is across the West, we never, I mean, never discuss the security interest of opponents, never their security concerns, their political systems, how their society works. I mean, all of this is put aside for these empty ideological slogans in which our motivations, they're always altruistic. We're always helping other people. Our incentives only human rights and democracy, and our adversaries are always, evil, but also hopelessly backwards. And if we just have the will to push them hard enough, they will fall over. And of course, their people will greet us, with open arms and flowers. And again, there's never any the discussions anymore about great power rivalry. I mean, this was the point of departure in international security. How do states compete for security? Never a topic. It's and and in the West, everyone has to speak in this language. It's a litmus test, I think, for participating in public debates. And the assumption is that this conformity around this makes us stronger. My argument is that it's quite dangerous. It's deluding. You fail to see the world as it is. And if you're going to see how we messed things up so bad with China, Russia, Iran, and, well, other adversaries of the hegemon as well, you can't really deal with this unless you recognize why you can't read your opponents anymore. I mean, it's I think this is one of the key problems we have. It also prevents course correction, for that matter. I did want to ask about one thing you said, though. You argue that
just one
go
point
ahead.
that I'd like to add to this, and I agree completely. Iran had the misfortune of being the designated enemy after the end of the Cold War, because for a period of time, regardless of what the intentions were towards Russia, in the public sphere, Russia was no longer the enemy. China back then was just beginning to become the factory of the world, and it was not demonized in Hollywood, in the media, in literature. The focus was on the Islamic terrorists, and of course, the Islamic terrorists meant Iran. It didn't mean ISIS and Al Qaeda and all those groups that actually Western intelligence agencies, along with the oil and gas rich countries in the Persian Gulf, created and funded. The real terrorists, just like in Ukraine, how they supported the fascist groups or the neo Nazis, whatever one wants to call them, for their own purposes. They helped them. They supported them. In our region, they supported these groups, but these were not the groups that were hated and attacked. It was Iran. They funded extremist groups in Afghanistan, in later on in Syria, in Libya, in Africa, and yet it was Iran that was the threat to the world, the axis of evil, as we all recall, after 9/11, when Al Qaeda, which was a U.S. proxy and lived under the first generation of the Taliban, which is different from now, but which again the United States and the Pakistani intelligence and countries in the Persian Gulf brought to power. Uh, we were told that 9/11 was carried out by them. Of course, nowadays, if increasingly it's becoming mainstream, the view that it was not just them, and that there were also people in Western intelligence agencies that were probably involved, or Israeli intelligence, according to Tucker Carlson's documentary. That's what increasingly seems to be the case. But in any case, when they carried out 9/11, Iran was demonized. So Iran had the misfortune of being the uh, the focus of hatred, and even during the endless wars, the war on terror, even though it was allegedly these groups who carried out. I mean, I'm sure they had something. They were part of it, but in any case, whether it was them alone or was with insider uh, with support from Western intelligence agencies. In any case, these groups which were hostile towards Iran, they carried out 9/11, but it was Iran that was being demonized, and these groups hated Iran. They saw Iran as the enemy because they get their ideology, from Saudi Arabia, and it wasn't Salafism and Wahhabism and Takfiri ideology is something that has always been promoted by the Saudis and the Qatar, and Qatar's its main mosque is called the Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab Mosque. So Iran for years was the number one enemy, and so that demonization through it, they put a lot of pressure on Iran, which led to the maximum pressure sanctions. But also, it created a very solid foundation in Western society with regards to their views on Iran. In other words, Iran was so deeply despised that if you said anything contrary to that that world, you would have been seen as utterly crazy. I mean, I experienced that a lot over the years. I recall in 2009, I was invited by CNN's Farid Zakaria on his show, and I was to have a 20-minute debate, and they promised to show the whole thing. Ultimately, they only showed 8 minutes of it, which is on YouTube. And throughout, he was insulting me. And ultimately, near the end, he said, uh, he said like, aren't you like embarrassed or ashamed that I don't remember exactly what he said, but like that you will be remembered as the mouthpiece of a dying regime. And to that's the mentality. And when they invited me, it was supposed to be like a discussion about the situation. And the whole time he was just insulting me and attacking Iran, as they do, and as they do today. When when you see Israeli officials going on Western media, they're treated very respectfully. But if I happen to appear, I'm attacked as if I'm like the source of great evil on this planet. So this since this began, of course, after the revolution, but during the post Cold War period, it was basically Iran that was demonized. The depth of this hatred and hostility and animosity and the power of this narrative is it's quite effective.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. But I guess one has to understand the mentality though, because in the West after the Cold War, the assumption was, well, to summarize it, Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. This is how this became truism across the West. This became essentially our political ideology. That is, the whole world would gravitate under liberal democracy and well towards liberal democracy and under Western leadership, and history would then just move, and then no one could resist this pressure, and this was the perpetual peace. And any country who went against it was simply authoritarian. They should be embarrassed. You can't stop this. And this is how, there was no talk about great power politics, but this is how one builds a hegemon. No, and legitimize hegemon. It was just, this was how the world was transforming, and there was no intellectual space really either to challenge this. But it was an interesting point you had though about Iran's ability to fall into two categories here, because after the Cold War, we went through two phases. First, right after the Cold War, the main targets were all these forever wars, these small, medium-sized states, and the reasoning was always the same: it was humanitarian interventions, it was a global war on terror, preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction, and the adversaries were always rogue states or part of the acts of evil, and Iran was put into that category. Then when the unipolar moments began to fail, you had the rise of rivals, you saw this shift about back to great power struggle. And then of course China, Russia fell in the category, but then yet again Iran transitioned into this as well to some reason, because it is quite a powerful state at the southern end of the Eurasian supercontinent, and also as Russia, China seeks this greater Eurasia, Iran is becoming essentially the third leg which this greater Eurasia stands on. So suddenly, Iran had misfortune, to be a demonized adversary in both. Yes, those, the question I wanted to ask before though was,
Sometimes when I would be invited to some conference somewhere, and they would be discussing global events, and they would start saying, Russia and China, and I would jokingly, I'd protest, and I said, look, we were here first, so you're replacing us. We used to be the top ranked, evil. We were the axis of evil before Russia and China were even mentioned, and now you're replacing us and putting us in third place. So yes, Iran had the misfortune of being evil in their eyes during the golden period of the uh, post Cold War years, and then when China and Russia began to rise, of course, Iran is a large country, a powerful country, but China is of a is much larger and much and more powerful, and Russia is of course much larger in size. but still they managed to keep Iran up there with Russia and China, no matter what happened.
Well, well, some countries are also coming back, though. That is, the Latin American countries. Well, if you're in the backyard of the U.S. hegemon, you historically will have a lot of military interventions and all, but during all those decades now of the Middle Eastern wars, the Latin Americans got a little bit of pause from being in the focus of the United States. Definitely during Cold War, it was concerned as the Soviet Union. It was feared it could have growing influence. Then, of course, after the Middle Eastern wars, we saw the greater focus then on China, Russia, Iran. But now suddenly, as they realize the world's becoming multipolar, they yet again have to cement control over over Americas as the backyard. So now you see this Monroe or Dunroe doctrine. So the Latin Americans, their break appears to be coming to an end, and they will yet again re-enter the focus of Washington, as well countries like Venezuela and Cuba, well, Panama, Nicaragua, many are experiencing now. But yes, yeah, my question was, we see Trump has intensified his talks about Iran not being allowed to get nuclear weapons, and also making the point that if Iran had nuclear weapons, it would certainly have used it. I mean, I can interpret this in, I guess, two ways, if not more. But the optimist in me would say that, by claiming this war was about preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, he can claim victory and go home. I mean, it's a nice off-ramp. The pessimist in me, though, would be a bit more concerned, arguing that, he's laying the ground for the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, there's been apparently a lot of talk about this in Washington, if this should be a step up the escalation ladder. And anyways, this kind of comments can help legitimize it or normalize it. I was just wondering, how do you assess this? Well, I would say so far the rumors that they are talking in Washington about using nuclear weapons against Iran.
Well, I think there's also a third way of looking at it as well, and that is that the war has failed, yet he talks about stopping Iran or preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons in order to say that, no, actually, I won the war. I have succeeded. And so it wasn't a total failure. Actually, I achieved my goals. But it doesn't mean that this is separate from one or the two different scenarios that you mentioned, or the two different ways of looking at it that you mentioned. It could accompany either of those. In other words, he could say this and use it as an off ramp, but he could say it and not use it as an off ramp because he feels that it would be too humiliating. So, and it could also, he could say it this and say, I have achieved victory, but still the discussions over using nuclear weapons could continue. I think that the myth of the Iranian nuclear weapon is something that the Americans have been using for decades. And so even those who know better, often when you listen to them talk, they talk as if there really was a nuclear weapon program, even though they know they don't mean to say it that way, but it is so deeply embedded in the narrative on Iran that sometimes people unconsciously seem to be acknowledging that it actually existed. The reality is that there never was a nuclear weapons program. The American government, American intelligence agencies admit that after 2003, Iran stopped working towards a nuclear weapon. But the reality is that Iran was never producing a nuclear weapon before 2003. And there are a couple of good books in this regard. I mean, Going to Tehran was a good book that I mentioned earlier, but one is, if people want to look into this, one is called Manufactured Crisis by Gareth Porter, and the other is called A Dangerous Delusion by Peter Oborn. Both are good books, and But in any case, after the signing of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal in 2015, Iran allowed for very, very intrusive inspections in Iran. The most intrusive inspections ever in history. And the amount of inspections that were carried out in Iran were more than the rest of the world combined during those years. The entire world, you know, on one side, Iran on the other, the inspections in Iran were larger in number and more intrusive. They never discovered any evidence that Iran had been pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And of course, some people nowadays would say, well, why did Iran produce enriched uranium at 60%? That goes back to the JCPOA. When Trump tore up the JCPOA, they renewed the sanctions, and Iran continued to implement its side of the bargain for 2 years, to just force the Europeans to return to the table. They didn't, and after that, Iran revived the program, and they gradually, when they still saw the West was not moving towards implementing their side of the bargain, Iran enriched uranium at higher degrees, at 60% ultimately, which is legal, in order to put pressure on the West for leverage so that they would come back to the negotiating table. But in any case, I can't say for certain what will happen in the future. I think that if any entity, whether it's the United States or the Israeli regime, seriously contemplates using even a tactical nuclear weapon, that will, I think, definitely push many countries towards developing nuclear weapons. I think that would be a game changer. And to be very blunt, that would include Iran. In fact, last night in that long interview, which I think your viewers should go and take a look at, the chair of the Supreme National Security Council, who is now a very important person in Iran, in Iran, he said that U.S. behavior towards Iran has created the incentive across the world for countries to develop nuclear weapons. And I think that implies that among Iranian experts, that incentive has been created as well. A poll that I saw before the 12-day war, the narrative of the state has always been that we don't want nuclear weapons. And so before the war, those who supported having nuclear weapons and those who were opposed, I think they were close to each other in numbers. Maybe those who opposed nuclear weapons were, if I recall correctly, they were a majority. After the 12-day war, I saw a poll in Iran where it was more than reversed. A significant majority of ordinary Iranians disagree with the position taken by the state and believe we should have nuclear weapons. So the more the United States threatens Iran or the Israeli regime, or the more rumors we hear, the more incentive there is, not just in Iran, but out everywhere. And then once that process begins, then there's no going back. That means you could have 30, 40 countries across the world, or across our region even, that would have nuclear weapons. And then imagine how easily that could bring about complete destruction across the world. However, one thing that I would like to add about the current situation is that at the moment, the United States is focusing on this new economic warfare, this new siege, this D-Day, as Trump likes to call it, where they're going to, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury says that they're going to overthrow the regime, as they like to call it. The chair of the Supreme National Security Council last night, Major General Mohsen Rezai, said very clearly that Iran is not going to allow them to succeed, and that any country in this region that cooperates with the United States to impose this siege on the Iranian people, Iran will react heavy-handedly, and basically said we'll use our military capabilities. And he said that if Iran is not allowed to export oil, no one will export oil, not even a barrel. And that's not, he said this doesn't just mean the Strait of Hormuz. If oil is exported through pipelines, um, those pipelines will be destroyed, or those uh, the the infrastructure for those pipelines will be destroyed. And I imagine that includes, for example, the Caucasus. If for example, and he didn't mention Azerbaijan, but if the Azerbaijani government assists with the U.S. attempt to strangle Iran, then I would assume that the same would happen to their uh, facilities. So if anyone tries to block the bridge between Iran and Russia, they will be seen as working with the enemy. So he was very heavy-handed. I mean, he was speaking about a very heavy-handed response, and he also said that Iran is in future, its politics will change, and Iran's stature today is enhanced greatly, and that will be reflected even in Iran's foreign policy decisions.